Welcome to the webinar, Global Energy Consumption Forecasting in the Age of Climate Change. Energy consumption depends on a wide variety of factors, such as population growth and the state of the economy. Also relevant are politics to address climate change, and so too the impact of geopolitical conflicts affecting the supply of energy. That there are so many factors going into energy forecasts explains why such forecasts can vary so widely. Investors and policymakers suffer the consequences of getting it wrong. But then so do we, for example, at the gas pump and our home heating bills. So getting it right is important to all of us, as we all need energy and want it to be affordable. To help us better understand the complexities of energy forecasting and what to expect, we've asked Yogi Schulz to join us today. So welcome, Yogi. Yogi, this is a subject of considerable interest to you, as reflected in both this week's newsletter for KEI and for others who rely on energy consumption for forecasts, for making investments, and policy decisions that affect all of us. Please share with us, Yogi, what you've learned.
Thank you, Perry, for that kind introduction. I'm pleased to share my presentation with the KEI community. In this presentation, I will discuss a global energy consumption forecast and the GHG emissions forecast to about 2050 based on researching multiple sources. The mix of energy sources is changing and will continue to change. The driver for this change is the energy transition that is intended to address the adverse impacts of climate change. At the end of this presentation, it will be interesting to see if you, one, believe the mix of energy sources will evolve differently from what I have forecasted, and two, whether you believe the energy transition will proceed faster or slower than I have forecasted. I've chosen the year 2050 because it's widely discussed target date that many governments, at least one international organization, and various environmentalists have set for the achievement of net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. My forecast, based on the sources I will share, suggests material energy transition progress by that date. However, you will see that I believe the world will still burn significant amounts of fossil fuels in 2050. I don't believe the planet will achieve net zero by 2050. Some supporting reasons are major emission producers like China, the United States, India, Russia, and Japan have made no commitments or very fuzzy commitments. Many countries are not tracking their commitments. Many countries are experiencing major citizen pushback as the cost of the energy transition becomes more apparent in their pocketbooks. The recent price increases of many products and services are an indirect cost of the energy transition and have contributed to the affordability crisis many households are experiencing. In any case, even after the energy transition, the world will continue to consume significant amounts of fossil fuels as chemical feedstocks. That will go on indefinitely. Who am I? I founded Corvell Consulting over 20 years ago. We offer information technology related management consulting. We've executed many project management and systems development assignments for our clients, and our clients mostly operate in the upstream oil and gas industry. So here's the presentation outline today. Here are the topics I'll touch on in our webinar. First, I'll look at data from the relevant past, historic energy consumption, and historic greenhouse gas emissions. Then I'll share some forecasts about these topics: energy consumption, atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions, energy transition forecasts. And we'll wrap up with some conclusions and recommendations related to the energy transition. Some commentators describe the energy transition as an effort to move the planet from bad to good. Unfortunately, this energy transition is not as simple, straightforward, and clear as this illustration would suggest. The current energy infrastructure provides an incredibly high standard of living and convenience to billions of people at an affordable price. These current advantages will be difficult to replicate in the New World. So let's start with historic energy consumption. It's grown astronomically as the first world standard of living has improved immensely. As I just said, the consumption has grown exponentially since the Industrial Revolution. Fuel sources have expanded from wood to coal to oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric, and then to nuclear. This evolution suggests multiple energy transitions occurred in the past, and some are still underway. So the historic per capita energy consumption, individual energy consumption has grown by a factor of 4 since the Industrial Revolution. This growth produced the high quality of life that we enjoy in the first world and increased the quality of life in less developed parts of the world. This chart shows the same data as the last slide. However, by not stacking the data, it illustrates how much the various energy sources contribute to total energy consumption. You will notice oil, coal, and natural gas are significant energy sources. That reality adds cost and complexity to the energy transition to low CO2 energy sources. These relative contributions must change significantly in the future if we are to achieve the energy transition. The scale of the change creates cost, complexity, and resistance. We recently reached a point where the energy production from renewable energy sources covers the growth in overall energy consumption. However, that milestone has not achieved any reduction in fossil fuel consumption. Now look at some historic per capita energy consumption for selected country. This chart illustrates the differences in regional energy consumption. World per capita consumption is about 1/3 of what Europeans consume. It's highly likely that the world consumption will approach what the Europeans consume by 2050. This upward consumption trend will trigger a huge growth in energy demand. This demand will be met by growth in multiple energy sources. It might also be a drag on the transition if it spurs use or consumption of fossil fuels. This chart also illustrates that high-consuming countries like the US and Canada consume double what the Europeans consume. That's an opportunity for North Americans to use energy more efficiently and lower consumption towards the European amount. The obvious opportunity for North Americans is to consume less gasoline for commuting. The amount of gasoline we consume for totally unnecessary horsepower is huge. Therefore, the amount of emissions we produce compared to Europeans is frankly ridiculous. So let's look at historic atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions. You'll see how these have increased. I think you've all seen this chart or a version of it about CO2 levels in the atmosphere from 1751 to 2022. The almost doubling of the global atmospheric CO2 levels from 280 to 420 parts per million since the start of the Industrial Revolution has caused climate change. This increase is a consequence of the incredible growth in mostly fossil fuel-based energy consumption that I described earlier. Climate change deniers like to say that 420 parts per million is such a small amount that it can't possibly cause climate change. They choose to ignore that the atmosphere functions normally when all its constituent chemicals exist within their respective narrow ranges of values. So what about the atmospheric CO2 over the past 800,000 years? The CO2 has fluctuated in this narrow band between 180 and 300 parts per million. Only in the 20th century has the concentration moved well above this range. This chart repudiates those who claim that CO2 has fluctuated in a much wider range, including higher than current levels. over geologic time. These individuals also claim that somehow these previous fluctuations are relevant to the current situation, when I believe they are not. This is a global warming potential and atmospheric lifetime for major greenhouse gases. Most of the discussion of greenhouse gases focuses on CO2 because, as you can see on the chart on the right, is about 80% of total greenhouse gas weight in the atmosphere. We sometimes forget that there are other greenhouse gases as well. The next most important are methane and nitrous oxide. The rest are small in volume but high in global warming impact. In oil and natural gas producing regions, methane is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. While Alberta is recognized as a world leader in reducing methane emissions from production, there are still improvement opportunities here. The big methane emission culprits from oil and natural gas production are the United States, Russia, and Iran. Now let's move on to some forecasts. The energy consumption forecasts, as Perry already said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So that's why we have wildly varying oil consumption forecasts. Forecasting is difficult in part because forecasters are frequently influenced by their personal goals and agenda, or the goals and agenda of the organization they work for. It doesn't take much talent to spin the numbers. So let's run through some examples. Oil and natural gas will peak this decade. In fact, oil is probably peaking this year. Frankly, this is wishful thinking forecast by Canada's Natural Resources Minister, Jonathan Wilkins, to preserve the government's narrative in favor of a rapid energy transition. The plateau in global oil consumption is coming around 2025, according to British Petroleum. This forecast is almost as optimistic as the minister's. Global oil demand is set to increase by 900,000 barrels per day in 2024 and slightly more than that in 2025. That's according to the International Energy Agency. Is it likely that oil demand will decline in 2026 when it increases in 2025? Seems unlikely to me. Oil consumption is will likely plateau and slowly decline in 2030s, mainly due to the growth of electric vehicles. Jackie Forrest, Arc Energy Research. This forecast is vaguer than the others, most likely because it's difficult to be more precise. This forecast is the one that I think is most likely. Another forecast, oil consumption will rise to about 120 barrels per day by 2050. It's just over 100 now. Now, this is from OPEC, hardly a neutral observer. This forecast doesn't even plateau. It implies no foreseeable energy transition. So you can see is a wide range of forecasts. So let's continue on with what I think is going to happen. What's driving the forecast? By major use categories. This forecast says that consumption will reach about 660 quadrillion BTU by 2050, up about 15% compared to 2021. And that reflects a growing population and rising prosperity. Electricity generation is the largest category and fastest growing, driven mainly by the energy transition away from fossil fuels toward electrification and expanding access to reliable electricity in developing countries. Residential and commercial primary energy demand declines about 15% by 2050 as efficiency improvements offset energy needs of a growing population. The industrial sector growth supports construction of buildings and infrastructure, plus the manufacturing of products that meet people's needs. Commercial transportation grows as expanding economies increase the need to move goods. Personal mobility also expands. The description of this forecast sounds so certain. There are, however, various risks, including the following, that can change this forecast. Change in the pace of the energy transition, change in the population growth forecast. There may be more countries where the birth rate declines below the replacement number of 2.1 children per woman. Additional demand from new technologies such as AI, cryptocurrencies, and blockchain. Wars involving fossil fuel producers such as Russia, the Middle East, and the former USSR countries. Domestic political unrest in major fossil fuel producers such as Angola, Libya, Mozambique, Nigeria, Venezuela. Continuing permitting gridlock for critical minerals, mines, electricity generation, and transmission facilities. Continuing slow growth in China due to the controlling policies of the CCP that stifle the economy, create financial risk, and increase regulatory uncertainty. Technology breakthroughs in battery performance and wind turbine reliability. The availability of critical mineral reserves may become a risk, but could be mitigated by breakthroughs in battery technology and discovery of new mineral resources. So in addition to the geopolitical issues that Perry mentioned earlier, there's this long list of risks that can affect whether this forecast you see here on the screen evolves as neatly as the authors would have us believe it will. So expanding on the last slide, what's driving the growth in energy demand? From the previous chart, it's these three areas that you see here on the pie chart that are driving growth for the energy transition, growth in developing countries, and data centers for AI, cryptocurrencies, and blockchain. The other major need is commercial transportation. The number of trucks, rail cars, and ships, and the ton kilometers they move are all going up. And as that happens, energy consumption increases. And then industrial consumption will go up as the population, and especially the urban population, increases the demand for industrial goods, industrial energy. She will have to go up to respond to that. Now, we should also talk a little bit about AI, because it will demand a shocking amount of electricity, and you've probably read some headlines about that. Now, I observe the following trends that will increase the rate of growth in data center energy consumption. So more sophisticated AI processes and increasing adoption of AI applications. We're just at the very beginning of that. Now, there are some trends that will reduce the rate of growth in data center energy consumption for AI. And these include improved algorithms, edge AI inference processing. The best example of that is the way Apple AI has been architected by Apple. The next generation of GPU chips, the introduction of AI-specific chips, and the introduction of hybrid quantum computing chips. Those will all help to dampen the growth rate. Now, you may all have heard about this Microsoft announcement about power for their artificial intelligence data centers. I've been wondering how many in our society might overcome their exaggerated fear of nuclear fission to develop nuclear energy to become a significant energy source. It looks like the tech giants will become the leaders. So here's the example of Constellation Energy recently announced that its Unit 1 reactor at 3 Mile Island, which closed in 1997, is expected to be revived by 2028, depending on regulatory approval. Now, you may recall that Unit 2 reactor at this location was the scene of a nuclear accident in March 1979. Constellation expects to spend $1.6 million to restart Reactor 1, and Microsoft will purchase carbon-free energy produced from the reactor to power its data centers for artificial intelligence. Now, this deal is feasible due to the tax credit offered by the Inflation Reduction Act, and we're going to hear a lot more about that because that's a multi-billion-dollar incentive, or some people say boondoggle, to cause a lot of industrial developments that are many of which are related to the energy transition. Now, another example, Google has signed a deal to buy electricity from small modular reactors These are viewed as less risky development than these traditional large reactors you see on this slide. However, they only generate about 300 megawatts. That's about a quarter of the capacity of the large reactors. So we'll see how those two and among other initiatives play out in the future. Now, we should also bring into the picture the world population. So here's the history and projection. This chart shows a similar growth by fuel type that's used to produce energy that we saw on a previous slide. It's no surprise that most of the lines are going up. Environmentalists who loudly push for a rapid energy transition to address climate change are unhappy with this chart. They don't like the projected increase in petroleum. They want it to decrease. They grudgingly accept the projected increase in natural gas, but want it to level off sooner. They're pleased that coal consumption is flat, but want it to decrease sooner. They like the significant increase in renewables, but want it to increase even faster. They like the modest increase in nuclear. However, some want it to increase much faster, while others want to decrease it. But my reaction to this slide is I'm surprised that hydroelectric isn't even on here, and neither is geothermal. I believe in both cases there's an opportunity for these technologies to play a significant role in the energy transition. However, because all these lines are going up, not down, makes the energy transition more difficult every day. Okay, so here's the OPEC raising its long-term demand forecast. I think we'd all expect OPEC to produce the most bullish oil demand forecast. However, the OPEC forecast isn't that much different from the forecast on the previous slide. On the energy transition, what's most disturbing about this fact is that OPEC oil demand forecast is still increasing in 2050. Another concern is that OPEC raised its own forecast 3 years in a row here. So all that creates doubt about the pace of the energy transition. Now let's look at the forecasts for greenhouse gas emissions. These forecasts for CO2 in the atmosphere vary widely based on economic growth forecasts, which increase wealth and energy consumption, and the actual pace of the energy transition from high CO2 fuels to low CO2 fuels. Also, the population forecast that we just saw increase influences this. The most optimistic forecast on this chart, the one on the right at the bottom, does not reduce the CO2 amount below 400 parts per million, when a number below 350 parts per million is widely seen as required to stop further increases in the global mean temperature. Now here's another look, the annual global emission forecast. This chart has 4 forecasts for 4 different scenarios. The top one is no climate policies means countries make no effort to address climate change. That creates a forecast with wide uncertainty range. That's why this line, it really isn't a line anymore. It's more a triangle. This uncertainty range is that wide because fossil fuel consumption of individual countries is difficult to forecast. Global average temperature will increase between 4.1 and 4.8 degrees by 2100 if no climate change policies are implemented. This temperature increase will likely produce a catastrophic impact on weather and on flora and fauna, and for many humans as well. The second scenario is current policies. It means the countries implement what they've previously announced. The forecast shows a smaller uncertainty range, but it's still some width because there's ambiguity in current policies. Some countries have not developed any policies, and the global mean temperature is expected to rise between 2.7 and 3.1 degrees by 2100. And that's just assuming that current policies will in fact be implemented. So the next one is pledges and targets. This one means countries will implement what they've agreed to do in the future. The forecast shows the progress possible if the pledges made to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions are in fact implemented, and the temperature will rise by only 2.4 degrees. Now, the last one is the 1.5 degree pathway. It describes emissions must decrease to zero, or frankly less, to hold the global average temperature increase to below 1.5 degrees. Notice how this line goes below the zero line. To reach the target of an increase of only 1.5 degrees, countries must go beyond net zero and remove an additional 5 to 8 gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's very ambitious. Now, the uncertainty width of these forecasts and the range of these forecasts is indicative of just how difficult this forecasting is at times. Okay, so let's look at some energy transition forecasts. Now, perhaps this collection of photos is a good way to illustrate the enormity of the energy transition challenge, because it's highly focused on electrification. These 4 photos illustrate the current electricity infrastructure that consists of generators, high voltage transmission lines, substations, and many local transformers. So we have to at least double the capacity of everything we have now for the energy transition. In many cases, a little more is required. For example, the current electricity distribution can handle a few electric vehicles in every block for overnight recharging. However, once there's an EV in every other garage, the number of low voltage transformers must double, and so must the capacity of the upstream portions like the substations, transmission lines, and generations. So that's a daunting task in terms of permitting, construction, commissioning, and overall operating costs. Another way to look at all of this is to look at fossil fuel demand and the energy transition. Everyone's asking this question: how quickly will we, or can we, advance the energy transition? Fossil fuel demand will decline, but still account for 40 to 60% of total energy demand in 2050s. So here are 3 forecasts for how the energy transition will unfold. The first would be a slow evolution, and the result would be that we're still using 61% of total energy demand in 2050 would be supplied by fossil fuels. Now that's down from 80% today, so that's a 20% improvement. Well, perhaps we get more momentum than that, and the fossil fuels supply only about half of total energy. And there's an optimistic forecast by which fossil fuels supply only 39% of total energy demand in 2050. That appears to be the best case outcome in 25 years from now. Now you'll notice that 39% is still quite a ways from zero. So how much longer will be required to move the percentage of fossil fuels demand close to zero is required to achieve net zero? Now, so 25 years, according to this forecast, are required to move from 80% down to 39%. And the rate of decrease is slowing toward the end of, as you would expect. Now, if McKinsey's optimistic forecast becomes a reality as the world approaches 2050, the energy transition could be achieved before 2100, perhaps as early as 2075. So here's another: worldwide share in electricity production of various technologies. This chart is different from the last chart by adding renewables to the forecast. This chart is more optimistic about the decrease in coal and natural gas than the last chart. Because the authors are focused on the solar energy transition, this chart is overly optimistic about the future growth of solar generation and pessimistic about the future of wind and nuclear. Whether renewables become the new normal increasingly hinges upon trade and industry development rather than simple decarbonization progress. Now, while wind and solar will dominate electricity grids depends on the ability of the technology to scale and overcome a series of barriers. These include how to deal with the seasonal variation for which batteries are ill-suited, the cost of managing large amounts of intermittency, the unequal availability of finance to support solar and wind investments. Supply chains may be poorly prepared for a rapid technology rollout and political resistance in various areas, and the willingness of government to embrace a solar revolution. However, solar has experienced a rapid adoption due to its simplicity, modularity, and mass scale replicatability. Wind electricity generation does not offer these advantages. And also, solar cells are advancing with a new technology called hybrid perovskite solar cells. Don't ask me to repeat that. Anyway, that's really a fascinating new technology which will help solar. Now, what about going beyond net zero? Net zero isn't actually the end of the need to address climate change, even though net zero is what we discuss all day long. The goal of net zero is to quit adding greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. We're adding about 2 parts per million of CO2 to the atmosphere every year. Growth will continue to rise until we achieve net zero. Net zero levels, the eventual value at which could turn out to be as high as 475 parts per million. However, this value does not return the atmosphere and the climate to the pre-industrial CO2 value of 275. So MN350 is an organization that believes we need to reduce the atmospheric CO2 to a maximum of 350 parts per million to address climate change. So there's more work to do even after net zero. Some conclusions: energy consumption will grow no matter what we might think, because population and economic growth will ensure that we have more demand. So the energy transition is necessary to avoid serious damage to the planet and the economic and social future of humans. The amount of skepticism, denial, and misinformation surrounding this conclusion is shocking. Second is that the energy transition is achievable. As is often the case when a problem arises, the solution is clear and achievable. We need to change the mix of technologies to produce energy. That's easily said, but rather difficult to do. There are some constraints on our ability to address climate change. They include the maximum pace of change people can absorb, the unpredictability of politics will slow or accelerate the transition, the enormity of the required investment to pay for the new energy infrastructure, and the pace of technology development for those technologies that enable the energy transition. These constraints will elongate the energy transition beyond what many are campaigning for. So these are the countries that that have the highest carbon footprints, and therefore their actions to reduce CO2 emissions and advance the energy transition will be most important. So first we have China. However, they're preoccupied by an economic crisis and a military arms race with the United States. Then we have the United States that's just starting to spend huge amounts on subsidies, grants, and tax credit to advance the energy transition. Then we have China. They're preoccupied by economic expansion and the vision of becoming a global power. And then 4, we have Russia. They don't care. They're distracted by a war that they started. And then we have Japan that's making slow progress and recently recognized that abandoning nuclear power generation was not wise. So that's not a very positive outlook. There's only one country, the United States, that's paying attention among the top 5. And then we have these 4 countries. They're huge methane emission contributors to total greenhouse gas emissions due to their significant oil and natural gas production. So they're Russia, the United States, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. If they would do something about their methane emissions, we would make huge progress on the overall energy transition. Now, methane emissions are actually easier to reduce because the number of sources is small compared to the sources associated with CO2. And the emission reduction impact of that volume reduction is much higher. The recommendations are that we need to accelerate what we're doing. Now, that's never easy. It's tempting to say, you go first, I'll wait, or claim I'll catch up and see how you do. We can't go faster than people are prepared to absorb the changes that are required. And I mean behavior in terms of their energy infrastructure, cost, those kinds of things. So we need to accelerate process in reducing emissions, carbon tax, energy conservation and efficiency. We need to accelerate development permitting because of the massive increase in electricity generation, distribution, and mining of critical minerals that's required. And we need to accelerate progress in exploiting local characteristics. Many people talk about this, but local characteristics such as sunshine, wind, topography, population density all influence what people will do or can do. Accelerate progress in the required technology, enhanced electricity control technology, technology to reduce the enormous amount of energy that's wasted or not consumed, even though it's generated, and processing CO2 into commercial materials. Keeping our planet from overheating will take many actions at the household, business, and national levels. And with that, we're at the end of the presentation, and it's time for questions.
I'm going to pose a couple that have been raised before I draw on the audience and for a general conversation. Yogi, you've talked about accelerating progress. As you and I have chatted many, many times, technocrats tend to be optimistic, particularly around the emergence of fusion, not just fission nuclear, but all of the hype and the capital that's now going into fusion energy. I'd like you to comment on that, and also comment on CO2 removal, that is sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Do you want to make any comments about whether or not there's grounds for hope in this regard?
Yeah, so comments in progress. I tend to think of much more mundane topics than nuclear fusion. I think of things like better windows. I tend to think of trading, when you're finished with your current car, is buying an electric vehicle or a hybrid and not another gasoline car. I think of riding your bicycle a little more rather than taking the car. I think of densification of our urban landscape and the furor over the rezoning to enable densification here in Calgary is an excellent example of the political and social issues the energy transition will trigger.
You're zeroing in on personal behavior, which is always difficult to change, whereas it always seems easy to get and invest in technology that means human beings don't have to make adjustments. So the technocrats are hopeful about fusion, are hopeful about sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. You've raised an extremely important point. Can we get human beings to modify their behavior? Alona?
Thank you. And thank you, Yogi, for just an outstanding presentation. And I'm going to jump way up to 50,000 feet because I'm a pop culture junkie. And you're all technical experts, and that's wonderful. I'm going to propose something called muskrat love. Musk raising Alberta talent, recognizing Alberta talent, because you've got this huge demand for electricity, which Yogi pointed out. You've got Musk, who did invest in solar battery packs and all this kind of stuff. He has a mother who is a fashionista. All you do is bring her to Alberta in a fashion show and showcase Alberta talent. Yogi, you mentioned methane. Alberta is a leader. Alberta was a leader in solar technology. We have the talent.
Yogi, you want to comment?
Well, okay, so you've touched on some of the political agenda stuff. You know that we are a democracy, which means we supposedly have responsible government, and that means that government responds to what they're being lobbied about. And the federal government has been lobbied intensively for many years by environmentalists with a concern about climate change is very real, but with an approach to solving that problem, which is totally ridiculous. And we've had our federal government in Canada and the EU and in the US buy into that.
There is so much scientific illiteracy in the people who cover these huge questions.
Right. So now we're getting into the issue of energy literacy. Right. Okay, and the lack thereof. And that's made worse by the self-imposed complexity of our markets and regulatory environments. That makes it harder to understand. And then that creates sometimes an opportunity to create deliberate political confusion, so nobody can tell what's going on, so we can't attach any accountability to regulators or politicians.
Let's come back to something that Alona alluded to, and that is the situation in Alberta. Some years ago, our sources of power, our oil sands, was viewed as dirty. It doesn't seem to be so much talk about Alberta's sources of energy any longer being dirty. We recognize that we've got a fossil fuel generator. We also recognize that the world is going to go through a transition, which isn't going to happen tomorrow. So there'll be a continuing demand for some source of energy until alternatives emerge. But what is the future for Alberta? I mean, maybe it isn't all bad. A little bit more CO2 in the atmosphere means it might be warmer here in the winter, and we don't have hurricanes. So
okay, so in southern Alberta, we have an opportunity to generate more solar. We're kind of at the edge. You know, the 49th parallel is not far from the maximum degrees from the equator where solar works. So we don't have that much, even though we pitch ourselves as sunny Alberta, we don't have that big a region where sun works. However, we also have some regions where wind works, and we have some regions along the foothills and in the mountains where hydroelectric can work. We should be expanding that, in my view. We also have regions where geothermal can work very well. Thank you very much. And I don't know if this is a pipe dream. I'm not a fan of CCUS because of its cost. However, you know, these technologies do become cheaper as we build experience. You know, Saskatchewan spent $1 billion with trying to capture CO2 in their coal-powered electricity generation station and pushing that into underground storage. So kudos to them, but that ended up being so expensive, they're not continuing it.
On one of your slides, you noted that solar was, in Europe in particular, a dominant new source. Europe seems to be accepting the fact that nuclear is in fact a renewable. And yet in Europe, your forecast, or that forecast, had nuclear declining. It would seem to me that if nuclear is achieving a new social license, that there is ground for optimism that nuclear may play a bigger role than what we historically have credited.
Yeah, so there's grounds for optimism. I mean, the French are going to expand their nuclear fleet, no doubt about that. The crazy Germans, who had the safest and best reactors on the planet, shut theirs down. Whether they're going to do a U-turn or not is astonishingly still a problem. And the problem there is that the far right is winning too many seats, and that prevents a saner coalition which has to include the Greens from restarting those nuclear reactors. It's beyond incredible.
Well, I'm exceedingly impressed by the thoroughness of your presentation, not just helping us understand the complexities of energy forecasting, which looks like a fool's game, frankly, with that many variables, whether it be geopolitical or technology or population forecast. There are just so many elements going into that I'm not sure that well, the variability says the forecasts are uncertain. And the consequences of that uncertainty are significant, as you pointed out, as it relates to our environment. A 4.5 degree increase, the value of my house might go up dramatically, where demand from the south increases migration to the north.
One of the areas of the planet that's going to be directly affected are those island nations in the Pacific. But let's talk about Florida. You can make a forecast that Florida is going to be half of the area is going to literally disappear into the ocean, even with very little climate change. With lots of climate change, that number might go up. So one of the actions item is don't buy a condo in Florida.
Look, it's not just Florida. I've done some research on coastal living in general. And if you look at the blue states and the red states, you'll see most blue states are coastal because that's the urban environments where the population of the United States has migrated to. I saw that with my high school class when the diaspora took place. People moved to everywhere from Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, California, Washington. I was one of the few that moved inland. I was prescient, you see. But on a world scale, the coastal living has been extremely popular, has been living in woods, both of which seem to be in jeopardy given the future that you've been addressing. So, yeah, it's just not the islands in the Pacific, it's coastal living everywhere. In a democracy, we tend to rail against being told what to do. That's called tyrants. We may face some of that south of here, given whatever happens on November 5th. In a democracy, you want to see demand coming from the bottom. You want to see it coming from your voters until they begin to change their behavior and feel that there's a genuine threat. And maybe that's a younger generation that is being educated about the risk of climate change. It seems we're going to have to, pardon the pun, weather the consequences of climate change unless we get human beings changing their behavior or tyrants in charge.
I think one of the things that was evident within the presentation is scalability. People just don't really have an idea of what, for example, hydropower. How many square kilometers or square meters does it take to produce 1 megawatt of power? And it works out to about roughly about a quarter of an acre of land is required to make 1 megawatt of power. And a megawatt is not really a lot. The long term, as far as where we can go with power, is with these SMRs and nuclear and that type of thing. And I know maybe someday, maybe way beyond time I'm around, we may see nuclear fusion. But it takes a long time to get that. It's not 2 years, 3 years, it's like 15 years, 20 years and more. Even with the SMRs, it's more than a couple of years. So people don't get this concept in mind that you just can't snap your fingers and shut this off and start this. It takes a long time to get things going.
Well,
And
some of the energy sources, as you've noted, Mel, require an infrastructure that doesn't exist today, hydrogen by way of example. And that would be very slow in the uptake because of the cost and the time it takes to build that associated infrastructure.
yeah, hydrogen is a whole big subject
but-
unto itself, but
Yogi?
So Mel, so the elapsed time numbers that you're quoting are accurate
Mhm.
in terms of our current experience. What fascinates me is that in times of crisis, we have somehow managed to dramatically reduce those elapsed times. I'm thinking particularly of the Manhattan Project in World War II. So how is it feasible like, what are we tying our own shoelaces together that lead to these ridiculously long, in my view, elapsed time for these projects? We've
Well,
done them, like,
is
in BC, we have this Site C hydroelectric that took years and years. How long did the Hoover Dam took less than a year and a half?
Yeah,
What
I
are we
guess
doing to ourselves?
it's the political density of the times. Let me call it that.
Yeah.
Well, let's wrap this up with one observation, and you've alluded to it, Yogi. The United States is investing, some say, close to $1 trillion with this new fund. If that isn't a Manhattan Project, I don't know what it is. But somebody is taking seriously all of what you've been referring to, and say that the United States once again may, in fact, be the leader in turning all of this around.